Shalom, and we are beginning today to study the Besorah of Yochanan, that is, the gospel, the good news of Yochanan. I want to first introduce the subject, but before I go any further, please stop and read the book. Read it all the way through, and then begin this. You'll want to read it again several times, perhaps chapter by chapter, as that will be the way we're looking at it. But read it first, because without having an essential understanding of what is in the book, there's not much point in talking about it. So first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about authority. Views on the authorship, origin, and historicity of this particular book have changed dramatically over the last century and a half. Go back 150 or more years, and most of the New Testament scholars would have said that the greatest information about the life and ministry of the person they called Jesus Christ could be gained from the Gospel of John. Today, a New Testament scholar would give the Gospel of John as the last choice of source information about this personage. Most such scholars today might even say that this book has nothing to say about that topic. So why has there been such a drastic shift in opinion? Going back to 1835, scholarly opinion, which was dominated at that time in most historical and biblical fields by the Germans, and tending more and more towards a liberal and critical rather than conservative believing perspective, pushed the dating of this book late into the first century or even into the second century. As a late work, it was regarded as secondary. Now, as a historian, I can tell you that what we always look for is primary information. That is, the person who is writing is a source. They are the person who actually saw and heard what they're writing about. Secondary means they talked to somebody who saw it. Obviously, not what we're looking for. Some even say it's just derivative. Where this author's version of events differs from Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it has been assumed that the alterations had been made to suit the theological purposes of the author. This perspective, however, began to change as recently as the 1970s, slowly legitimizing this work as a source of information about the Messiah's life and his ministry. This is very important. The Jewish annotated New Testament, produced by Jews who do not believe that Yeshua is the Messiah, dates this book between 70 and 130 CE, the earliest date being on account of mention being made of the destruction of the Mikdash. We know it was destroyed in the year 70. In 1978, Dr. J.A.T. Robinson gave a paper to an Oxford Conference on the Gospels entitled "The New Look on the Fourth Gospel." He set out 5 presuppositions belonging to critical orthodoxy in the first half of the 20th century, attempting to demonstrate that each was in need of and in the process of re-examination. These were the 5 presuppositions that had been held. The fourth book is dependent on the other sources, so it's a secondary source, including at least one of the other 3 Gospels. The author's background differs from that of the tradition he reports. So they're suggesting that he wasn't even a Jew. His work is a serious witness not to the historical person of Yeshua, but to the Messiah of faith. So this is all about faith. The author is said to reflect the latest stage of theological development in so-called, what they call, first century Christianity. He is neither the disciple John nor, and this is most important, an eyewitness. In fact, it was stated that the fourth writer had altered his material to suit his own purposes. Furthermore, it had been said that the writer dispensed with the tradition to which he presumably was indebted, that is, Judaism and the Tanakh, and theologizes the history he's interpreting for a late, primarily his Hellenistic audience, by which time any eyewitness links would have disappeared. It is precisely this presupposition of the literary dependence of this author on the other three works, with all the implications that follow, that is being most widely and seriously challenged by scholars today, which is definitely good news for us. The issue is no longer one of authorship, but of tradition. Is the tradition behind the Besorah of Yochanan independent of the synoptic tradition or not? Hopefully you have all also read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But now we ask the question, who wrote the fourth Besorah? Christian theories abound concerning authorship of this book. The popular view is that this is the aging disciple of Yeshua, Yochanan. However, somewhat surprisingly, nowhere in this book does the author actually state his name. So we have to ask, what is the external or historical evidence concerning authorship? If you'd like to know more about external evidence, Christian scholars Donald Guthrie, Gary Berg, and Donald Carson all offer thoughts on this subject. And you can find their materials probably on Amazon. The Besorah of Yochanan identifies the author in this way, as the beloved disciple or the beloved Talmid, usually acknowledged as Yochanan, the Talmid of Yeshua. Irenaeus, who was born in 115 to 142 and died in about 200, is the first Christian writer to mention this book. The dates for Irenaeus are important because only the earlier dating of his birth supports his claim that he actually knew Polycarp, who was a Talmid of Yochanan. In his work Against Heresies, he states that the author of the fourth gospel was John, the Lord's disciple, that the gospel was published at Ephesus, and that John remained at Ephesus until the time of the Emperor Trajan, between 53 and 117. Eusebius, the Greek historian of Christianity, who wrote from 260 to 265, reported this, and he said that Irenaeus' authority for these statements was in fact Polycarp, who learned truth from the original Talmudim, and Yochanan in particular. According to Eusebius, Irenaeus himself, in a letter to his friend Florinus, reminisces of their childhood conversations with Polycarp. Irenaeus' testimony has been dismissed by some, chiefly because they've concluded that Yochanan, the Talmud, could not have written this book. So therefore, obviously, Irenaeus is lying. No other way of putting it, really. This presupposes that Irenaeus' only source of information was Polycarp. But he mentions another source, a man born well before the end of the 1st century, who died in 177 at well over 90 years old. And he would have had other significant links as well, living at the time that he did. Church leaders after Irenaeus assume the apostolic authorship of the 4th Gospel without question. These include Tertullian, Clement of Alexandria, and Origen, reporting Irenaeus' opinion as worth noting and without any suspicion that it would be incorrect. Sadly, we have no specific written word in support of acknowledgement of this book by the people for whom it was originally written, Jewish followers of Yeshua. But the evidence for the early martyrdom of Yochanan, the Talmud of Yeshua, is often given as supporting his authorship. Mark 10:39 suggests that both Yaakov and Yochanan were told they would drink from the same cup as Yeshua. Supposedly, this was referring to a martyr's death. So Yochanan may have suffered the same fate as Yaakov. We know how Yaakov died. Assyrian martyrology, a list of martyrs, written in about 411, commemorates both Yochanan and Yaakov on the same day and describes them as apostles in Jerusalem. Aphraates, a pagan convert during the reign of the anti-Christian Persian king Shapur II, that's 309 to 379, states that apart from Stephen, Shimon Kepha, and Shaul, there were only 2 martyr apostles, Yochanan and Yaakov. Is there evidence for the early martyrdom of Yochanan? Well, the Mark 10:39 prediction doesn't necessarily indicate martyrdom, only suffering, and does not prove that martyrdom was early. The idea that the 4 writers would have adjusted their accounts instead of recording what really happened is a presupposition of modern, critical, and decidedly liberal scholarship. These are people who do not believe that the scriptures are the word of God. Some of this supposed evidence may be dismissed since the martyrologies and the homily by Aphraates may even confuse Yochanan ben Zechariah with Yochanan the Talmud of Yeshua. But here are some modern thoughts concerning the authorship of the 4th Gospel. In light of the text's silence on the name of the author, a number of theories have been proposed in recent times. Some would like to consign this work to the pseudepigrapha, spurious writings, especially of Jewish writings, ascribed to various biblical patriarchs and prophets, but composed approximately 200 years after Yeshua. Thus, all the eyewitness details are merely a device, they say, to create the impression of apostolic authorship. However, there are no known cases of works once recognized as pseudonymous ever losing their ascription at a later date. So once they have been adjudged to be false, they have never been resurrected. Could it have been written by John Mark, or John who had access to the Kohanim? Another John. A lot of Yochanans around was a common name. Was it written by Yochanan the Elder? Which could be one of the disciples, but it could also have been a disciple of one of Yeshua's disciples. Evidence of the existence of an elder John may be suggested by the introduction to the second and third books of Yochanan, where the author uses this title. Rejecting the critical attempts to discredit and demean this book, what do we actually know about the author of the book? And this is very important. The author was definitely a Jew. He was familiar with current Jewish opinions. We see this in messianic expectations, the importance of the various religious schools of thought, disparagement of the Jews of the diaspora, the Hellenistic Jews, hostility between Jews and Samaritans. In all, the author demonstrates a deep and broad knowledge of Second Temple era Judaism, Jewish practice, and methods of biblical interpretation. This is a quote from the Jewish New Testament that I mentioned earlier. The author is familiar with Jewish observances and customs, the ceremonial pollution of entering a Gentile court. Sukkot, not mentioned directly but hinted at by symbolism of living water and the light of the world that we will talk about in chapters 7 and 8. And the last day of the Feast of Sukkot was the great day, chapter 7. Customs and traditions at a marriage feast, chapter 2. Customs of burial, chapter 11. His vocabulary, his sentence structure, the symmetry and numerical symbolism, expression, and arrangement of thoughts are essentially Hebrew. The source of the imagery of the narrative is clearly from the Tanakh. While Greek words are used, the spirit and the heart by which they come alive is Hebrew. The Tanakh, especially Torah, is the major source of this author. Yehudia was the home of the Word become flesh. These people were his own people. Judaism is constantly viewed as the starting point. Without a background in Judaism, you cannot understand what is going on here. The writer assumed as axiomatic that the scriptures cannot be broken. They are the word of God. What is written in the prophets is assumed to be true. Types of the Torah are applied by Yeshua to himself. The serpent in the wilderness and manna from heaven, also water from the rock. The author clearly was a Jew of Yehudia, and his local knowledge is precise. Bet Anya, beyond the Yarden, a place forgotten by the time of origin, is distinguished from Beit Anya near Jerusalem. The location of the latter is given as 15 stadia away. Enon, near Salim, is not mentioned anywhere else, indicating direct knowledge by the author. Topography, especially that of Jerusalem, is precise, including the pool at Bethesda, the pool of Siloam, the Wadi of Kidron. These are not mentioned in the other Besorot. The pavement, Gabbatha, with its raised judgment seat. Allusions to the Mikdash, 46 years in building, mention of the treasury of the Mikdash and of Solomon's portico. The author's use of Tanakh quotations demonstrates that he is not dependent on, and this is very important, the LXX, that is the Septuagint, the earliest extant Greek translation of the Tanakh from the original Hebrew, and it suggests that he personally knew Hebrew. Some passages agree with both the Hebrew text and the Septuagint, where both agree, where the Hebrew text and the Septuagint are in agreement. Some agree with the Hebrew text against the Septuagint. A few differ from both Hebrew and the Septuagint where they agree. Some differ from Hebrew and the Septuagint where they do not agree. Some are free paraphrases of various Tanakh passages. But nowhere does a quotation from the Tanakh agree with the Septuagint against the Hebrew text. Another question that comes to everyone's mind is the author's doctrine of the Logos, or the Mamre. Well, first of all, it is Yudean and it is not Greek. It is Jewish. He views the Logos, or the Mamre, as representing the divine will manifested in the person of Yeshua. Philo, a Hellenist Jew, viewed the Logos as abstract divine reason. But we see a very different perspective in the book of Yochanan. Qumran documents have many parallels to this book, indicating that this book is essentially a Yehudian document. And we see the author as an eyewitness. He is not a secondary source, but a primary source. He offers descriptions of specific people, and he offers them in minute detail. We can look at chapter 3 and examine his description of Nakdimon, or Nicodemus, of Eliezer, Lazarus, of Shimon, the father of Yehuda Iscariot. The author was aware that Iscariot was a local or family name, and he applies it both to Yehuda and to his father Shimon. He notes details of time, the number of days before the raising of Eleazar, the duration of Yeshua's stay in Shomron. Specific mention is made of the hour at which events occurred, the 10th hour in chapter 1, the 6th hour in chapter 4, the 7th hour in chapter 4, and about the 6th hour in chapter 19, and it was night in chapter 13. He notes details of number: 2 Talmudim of Yochanan the Immerser, 6 water pots, 5 loaves and 2 fishes, 25 or 30 stadia, 4 soldiers, 200 cubits, 253 fish. He offers circumstantial details. The boy had barley loaves. When Miriam poured the ointment, the house was filled with the fragrance of it. Something unlikely to be mentioned by a person who was not actually there. The branches used at the triumphant entry were palm branches. Roman soldiers came with the officers of the Kohanim to arrest Yeshua. Yeshua's tunic was seamless. The face cloth in which Yeshua was buried was wrapped and lying in a place by itself. Shimon Kepha was grieved because Yeshua said to him a 3rd time, "Do you love me?" The author is a Talmid of Yeshua. His relationship with Yeshua is made clear in this book. From the scope of his descriptions of Yeshua's ministry, from the call of the first Talmid to the appearance after his resurrection, He is acquainted with the thoughts and feelings of the other Talmudim at critical moments, as we see throughout the book. He recalls words spoken among themselves. He's familiar with the places to which they withdrew for time alone. He's acquainted with the imperfect or erroneous impressions they initially received. He was obviously close to Yeshua. He knew Yeshua's emotions and comments. He knew the grounds of Yeshua's actions. He knew the mind of Yeshua in many instances. And thus, we come to the conclusion that the author was, in fact, the Talmid Yochanan. Chapter 21, verse 24, assigns authorship to the Talmid whom Yeshua loved. This disciple is mentioned by the same title twice in the narrative around Yeshua's death and twice afterwards. He is known to the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest. He stands in close relationship with Shimon Kifa. He must have been one of the sons of Zebedee, or one of the two other unnamed disciples present. The synoptics present only Shimon Kifa, Yaakov, and Yochanan as standing in a unique and special relationship with Yeshua. The author of this Besorah cannot be Shimon Kifa, as we understand when we read chapter 20, verse 21. Yaakov was martyred very early, as we read in Acts 12, verse 2. This leaves Yochanan, the Talmid of Yeshua. And as for the dating of this Besorah, well, critical scholars had chosen to set this book in the late 2nd century until the discovery in 1934 of a small fragment of papyrus containing a few verses from Yochanan 18. This is in the University of Manchester, the John Rylands Library. This fragment became famous as 52 and is now dated by a consensus of New Testament scholars and papyrologists at 125 CE. Obviously not part of the original document, this fragment came from Egypt. It would have taken several decades to have been circulated, copied, carried to Egypt, and buried there. This suggests a dating for Yochanan's Besorah as late 1st century. The second contributing factor was the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947. The scrolls exhibit much of the imagery and symbolism that had formerly been attributed to Christian Gnosticism. For example, the war scroll from Qumran is titled The War of the Sons of Light with the Sons of Darkness. Concepts such as this, which were thought to indicate a late date for Yochanan because of their supposed connection with Christian Gnosticism, have now turned up in documents written as early as the 2nd century BCE. Yochanan's knowledge of Luke is likely, so it would not have been written before 80 to 90 CE. The assumption that Yochanan was written probably in the last decade of the 1st century is today almost universally accepted, debunking all of the critics who believed that it was written later was derivative, was simply another assessment that came as a secondary source. Yochanan is proved to be the author, and those who believe that all 5 books, Hitagalut, the Besorah, and the 3 letters, are by one man, and that man, the Talmid Yochanan, find common ground in dating all 4 of these in the years 90 to 100 CE. And there is more external evidence regarding the date of Yochanan's Besorah. Yochanan's long life and his death in very old age is attested by those who came later, Irenaeus, Eusebius, Jerome. That he was the last to write is also mentioned by Irenaeus, Clement, according to Eusebius, and Eusebius himself. And one of the questions that arises is who were and I'm going to spell it for you because if I say it, you won't know what it is. Loudios, Yehudias, of whom Yochanan speaks. This is usually translated Jews, but more accurately translated Judeans or Yehudians, since the only people whom Yochanan could have been addressing when he wrote this book are descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov by birth or by conversion. Why does he refer to Yehudians? This was a kind of shorthand. It was a way of referring to the ruling power in Jerusalem and those who went along with their rulings. These were the Jewish authorities, the Jewish leaders, very much like the UK United Synagogue and the chief rabbi, which sets rules in orthodoxy very much as if all Jews should follow them, but other Jews do not follow them. And it claims to speak for all Jews, even those it doesn't recognize, including the Reformed, progressive. So whether they lived in Jerusalem, in Yehudea itself, or elsewhere, those who agreed with or went along with the power base in Jerusalem were known as Yehudians, a group singled out by our author. Over the past 20 years, Jewish interest in the New Testament, as they call it, has grown, and Jewish scholars are now talking and writing about it, not only about Yeshua and about Shaul, but also about all of the books themselves. They are questioning not the author's Jewish credentials, but the way in which he has been viewed by Christians. This relates not only to the translation of this word, Yehudias, as Jews rather than Yehudians, but to the purpose of his writing and his intended audience. I'm going to go on next time and speak about the inspiration of scriptures, but before I do, I want to read this. It's a word from Daniel Boyarin, professor of Talmudic culture in the departments of Near Eastern Studies and Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley. His words: Jews not infrequently argue that Christianity appropriated the Hebrew Bible and turned it to its own non-Jewish purposes, thus distorting its meanings. This book challenges that claim, the book that he wrote, challenges that claim in two ways. On one hand, the implication of my argument is that Christianity hijacked not only the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well, turning that thoroughly Jewish text away from its cultural origins among the Jewish communities of the diaspora in the first century, and making it an attack on the traditions of the Jews, traditions that I maintain it sought to uphold and not destroy, traditions that give the narrative its richest literary and hermeneutical context. On the other hand, this book challenges the notion that the New Testament itself is an appropriation, or even better, a misappropriation of the Old. If the interpretations offered here, and his book is called The Jewish Gospels, hold water, then the New Testament is much more deeply embedded within Second Temple Jewish life and thought than many have imagined even. And this I emphasize again. In the very moments that we take to be most characteristically Christian as opposed to Jewish, the notion of a dual Godhead with a Father and a Son, the notion of a Redeemer who himself will be both God and man, and the notion that this Redeemer would suffer and die as part of the salvation process. At least some of these ideas, the Father-Son Godhead, the suffering Savior, have deep roots in the Hebrew Bible as well, and may be among some of the most ancient ideas about God and the world that the Israelite people ever held. The Jewish Gospels, Daniel Boyarin. Think about that. And in 2 weeks, we'll be back to talk about the inspiration of the Scriptures before we get into Yochanan, the Besorah. God bless you.